saw was that they were saying that there was nothing to worry about to begin with. Then they said, oh, there might be a little bit of inflation, but don't worry. Then it was, oh, there might be high levels of inflation, but it may be transitory. And now we have 6.2% inflation in this country in the official numbers, and the unofficial number is likely over 10%. If you use the 1980 measure for inflation, it is likely that we are seeing somewhere between 13 to 15% inflation in the United States. It is insane.
It's pretty clear inflation has been going nuts. So how do we protect ourselves from this? Let's hear from Michael Saylor and let's see what he has to say.
In the biggest year of political unrest and inflation in our business life, gold is a complete abysmal, utter failure. Complete, right? Yeah. And so you could just start with that observation. Gold is a complete, utter macroeconomic failure. And if you waited for 40 years for a year like this, you finally got it, and it was useless. On the other hand, we knew that long bonds are overvalued, right? So bonds and gold as asset classes are just looking scary as heck. And you've got a conventional inflation hedge. If you want low risk conventional monetary inflation hedge, you buy the S&P index. If you want a bit more edge, you buy the NASDAQ index. 34% on S&P. It implies to me that the monetary inflation rate or the debasement rate is 34%, plus or minus, the risk premium. Maybe it's 31% with a 3% or 4% risk premium. But if I had to guess, well, what's the inflation rate? I would say, well, CPI is 5%. And producer price indexes, if you talk to anybody that manufactures or does anything in the real world, they'll tell you their costs are 20 to 25%, 30% more. And if you look at the S&P index, it's screaming at you 30% inflation, and Bitcoin's beating by 10x that.
Does this mean we should all YOLO into Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies? No. In my opinion, it's important to have a balanced portfolio, and I think gold and other commodities are an essential part of a portfolio. It seems like people holding cash and bonds will get wrecked in the coming years if this inflationary environment continues. So if you can't deal with your assets being so volatile, perhaps precious metals are a good way to go, as there is a somewhat limited supply. If you like this content about inflation and macroeconomics, let me know by dropping a like on this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing. When you subscribe to the channel, you make me feel like this.
Yeah, boy. That's it.
Now we're going to hear from Lyn Alden. She believes it's really important to study the 1940s, where there was a high inflationary environment, so we can learn from history. Let's have a look.
And so you had a very inflationary environment. The difference was that because federal debt as a percentage of GDP was 130%, they could raise interest rates to 5% or 10% or higher because it would bankrupt the government. So they had no choice. They just had to hold interest rates low, despite the fact that inflation was high. And so if you were holding cash or treasuries, you just got annihilated on an inflation adjusted basis for like a 9-year period where they just held rates super low, even though inflation peaked at 19% year over year in the 40s, and the overall average inflation for that decade was about 6%. And you just sat there earning roughly 0% on your T-bills and roughly 2.5% on your longer dated treasury bonds.
So when you look at this, you had a second tweet that basically said this is the widest gap that we've had on record, and you'd have to go back to the 40s and kind of the situation you're talking about there. Is your thought process that we now are entering the exact same situation where they're going to have to keep the rates low for a decade or so, and we can look to the 40s as the actual guide for what to expect moving forward? Or do you think there's some similarities, but we may get kind of a different outcome or a different action? One, they obviously have the hindsight of what happened in the 40s and the 70s, but also they may have some different thoughts in terms of what to do moving forward.
So I find that the 40s is the most instructive analogy to be familiar with. Basically, I would say it's not going to be identical to that. There are differences that I can go over, but anyone who's not familiar with the 40s is going to be in for a rough time, I think, and confused about markets. And so it's a useful period to study in terms of fiscal monetary policy. So I would say in those areas, fiscal monetary policy is likely to be very similar to the 1940s. There are some differences, and so obviously there's a different geopolitical environment. We're not in a world war. Instead, there's basically spending related to lockdown things and basically fiscal stimulus in that regard. So there's still kind of similar fiscal environment, but it's for different purposes. There's very different demographics in the developed world, right? So you have a much older population, and so some of these structural deficits aren't really going to go away anytime soon. Whereas at the end of World War II, they were able to eventually get their deficit away, at least for several years.
I think it's really exciting to be able to learn from history, and that the average Joe has no idea about this, meaning we can set ourselves up for an opportunity. I just want to emphasize that this is definitely not financial advice. Please do your own research when making any financial decisions. If you've liked this video, drop us a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment. Do you think this inflationary environment will continue? We'll catch you all very soon. Cheers, guys.